Well, welcome to week number 4. Last week in the class, we talked a lot about some of the reasons why we have government intervention in different aspects of the economy. This week, we're going to turn our attention primarily to some of the factors that we consider in determining whether or not we should have public expenditures and public intervention into the economy. So let's take a really quick look at some of the primary factors that we're going to consider in evaluating public expenditures, and again, whether or not we should have public expenditures to begin with. So when we're deciding whether or not it's something the public sector should be involved in, obviously, number one, we're going to look at the need for the program or the need for the project. We do a lot of needs analysis. We will do a lot of citizen satisfaction surveys to look at how satisfied citizens are with the services that they are being provided with by government. If we do identify a need for something that's not being provided then by the private sector, that obviously is a justification for public involvement. We've talked a lot in this course up to this point in time about things like market failures. And when the private sector either chooses not to provide or produce a good or service, or simply because of logistical reasons cannot provide or produce that good or that service. So we consider whether or not there are market failures as a second factor in determining whether or not we should have public intervention. If we have market failures, then obviously the private sector is not providing and producing something that society has deemed as necessary to be provided and produced. So therefore, the only other alternative is for government to get involved. So again, another justification for government involvement. Third factor we look at is the form of intervention. So what type of government intervention are we talking about? Are we talking about a government intervention whereby the government will both provide the resources as well as do the hands-on production of that good or service? Or are we talking about contracting out and privatization, whereby government will provide the resources, but then will contract with a private sector corporation to actually do the production of that good or service? So how much and what extent of government intervention are we looking at? A fourth factor that we oftentimes consider, the design features of the policy or the program itself. So for instance, is it an eligibility-based program? If it's an entitlement program that is eligibility-based, chances are we are probably going to need to have government intervention to make sure that those eligibility standards are being met. Government can change those eligibility standards. And so if it's a federal entitlement program, Congress can change those eligibility standards, but it will have to do that through the authorization process, through the federal budget process. It's something that the private sector cannot do. It's something that needs to be done through enabling legislation, needs to be done through Congress. So therefore, you would want to have that type of government, public sector involvement. Fifth factor, we oftentimes consider the responses of the private sector. So how will the private sector respond to having this government intervention? If we are intervening in terms of constructing a publicly owned and operated recreation center, how will all the privately owned gyms in the area respond to having this competition from this government facility? Will it cause them to lower their rates? Will it cause them to provide different types of services or offer different amount of hours per week? So what types of responses do we anticipate seeing as a result of this government intervention? Number 6 factor, we'll look at the impact of government intervention on efficiency. So will having the public sector involved in provision and or production, will that have an adverse impact upon efficiency? We know that when we privatize, one of the primary justifications for privatization is to enhance the efficiency. You can bring down the cost, you can introduce more competition. By introducing more competition, costs go down because you have a bigger supply that's being offered, so therefore lower costs. And the private sector oftentimes is seen as being able to do these things more efficiently, producing more output with fewer inputs than the public sector. So the public sector is going to intervene in this aspect of the economy. What does that then mean for the efficiency of the production of those goods and services? A 7th factor is benefit distribution. So how are the benefits of this program being distributed throughout our society, throughout our economy? If it's something that's done purely by the private sector, then those benefits will be distributed only to those individuals who have the fiscal wherewithal to actually purchase those goods and those services. If we want a broader distribution of benefits throughout all segments of society, then we're probably going to have some government intervention. And that government intervention may come in the form of subsidizing the production to make sure that these goods and services that people cannot afford are still being provided to those individuals. So how broad or how narrow will the benefit distribution be? The broader the benefit distribution through society, the more that argues for public intervention in provision and production. An eighth factor is we look at the values that we talked about before. So the balance between equity and efficiency. Are we more concerned with equity? Or are we more concerned with efficiency? Typically, and this is not always the case, but for the most part, typically, if we're more concerned about equity, we're probably going to trend more toward public intervention. If we're more concerned about efficiency, we're probably more likely to then leave that to the private sector. The objectives that we're trying to achieve, our goals and our objectives. How qualitative versus quantitative are those goals and those objectives? You know from your time in the MPA program that the goals and objectives in the public sector tend to be more qualitative as compared to the quantitative goals that we get in the private sector. So they're very qualitative types of goals that would argue more for public intervention. If there are more quantitative types of goals that are empirically easy to measure, then that's something that the private sector can do perhaps more readily. But when we have public intervention, we have to try and make sure that we are able to measure those more qualitative goals and objectives. Performance measurement in the public sector historically is much more difficult to do than the private sector because of the qualitative nature of these goals and objectives. And then factor number 10, which is one of the most important factors, the political reality of public intervention. How politically feasible is it to have the public sector intervening in the provision and production of this good or service, as opposed to leaving it to the private sector? Well, the political reality will oftentimes depend upon the result of the previous election. And so if you have a very conservative administration and a conservatively dominated Congress, that conservatively dominated Congress will probably be much more likely to support leaving it to the private sector and will oppose government intervention. If you have a more liberal type of administration, a more liberally controlled Congress, then you're probably going to see more public sector intervention. So again, just how politically feasible is it to have private or public intervention in the provision and or production of this good or this service? Another aspect of this political realities type of argument is this idea of expectancy theory that we talked about a couple of videos back, where government will respond to a crisis by intervening in the economy. And then once that crisis is over, government will continue that intervention because people have come to expect that it's something that is done by government. So if people expect that this is something they're going to get from government, and then you try to privatize it, politically, that could be a difficult sell to voters because they're expecting to get it from government. If it's something that historically has been done by the private sector and then government comes in to start providing and producing that good or service, then you're probably also going to have some resistance on the part of voters because that's not the way it's always been done. So there are a lot of factors that we have to consider in terms of government intervention in provision and production of different types of goods and services. Well, how do we evaluate then the success, the effectiveness of government intervention in different aspects of the economy? There are a lot of different methods that we typically use for evaluation. Just for the purposes of time in this video, the two that we are going to look at briefly: cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis. Cost effectiveness analysis is typically used more in the world of public policy and policy analysis. Cost benefit analysis tends to be used more in the world of budgeting and finance. And the difference between the two, if you haven't covered those topics already in the program, is that with the cost effectiveness analysis, we are essentially looking at the scenarios that will happen with government intervention in provision and production of a good or a service. So what will this mean? Well, what are some of the long-term outcomes, some of the long-term consequences in terms of how well we are able to achieve our goals and our objectives? We do a lot of what's called scenario writing and cost effectiveness analysis. So if government gets involved with this program or this policy, what scenario is going to occur? What's the likelihood that this goal will be achieved? And so, say for instance, you want to reduce the amount of homelessness rates among veterans. Well, if government gets involved with subsidizing this housing program in a cost effectiveness analysis, then how effective is government intervention in providing this program as compared to it being done by the private sector in terms of reducing those rates of homelessness for veterans? But again, what's the scenario that's going to occur? But the difference between a cost effectiveness analysis and a cost benefit analysis is that a cost benefit analysis usually focuses more on quantitative indicators. It focuses more on the dollars and cents of the costs versus the benefits. So in a cost benefit analysis, you will identify here are the costs of government intervention, and here are the benefits that will accrue because of government intervention. You then monetize or add a dollar value to those costs and to those benefits. At the end of the day, what you will then do is you will calculate this thing called a benefit cost ratio. So you'll take the net present value of your benefits and divide those by the net present value of your costs. And any benefit cost ratio that is 1 or above means that your benefits are exceeding your costs, which makes it economically feasible. Any benefit cost ratio below 1.0 would mean that your denominator, your costs, will be greater than your benefits, so therefore it's not economically feasible. So you've got a couple of different projects that you're deciding between. Should the government build the recreation center? Should the government build the senior center? So you've got project A versus project B. Benefit cost ratio of the recreation center ends up being a 1.4. Benefit cost ratio of the senior center is a 1.1. That's empirical evidence that government should intervene and should create that recreation center as opposed to constructing that senior center. Now, the problem with benefit cost ratios is that it's oftentimes difficult for us to monetize the value of benefits and the value of costs. And to kind of illustrate this for you a little bit, whenever I teach a policy class, I always use an example from authors Weimer and Vining. And Weimer and Vining take us in their textbook through a protracted example of a cost-benefit analysis. And the example that they use is the example of a government wants to decide if it should increase the tax on alcoholic beverages. So what they want to do is they want to put together a cost-benefit analysis to monetize the cost of increasing the tax on alcohol versus the benefits of increasing the tax on alcohol. It's not that easy, though, because what government's going to have to consider is the government's going to have to consider what's called the elasticity of demand for alcoholic beverages. So different types of alcohol will have different elasticities among the public. Wine may have a different elasticity than beer. Also, those elasticities are going to be different depending upon the age of the consumer. So younger consumers tend to have less price elasticity when it comes to beer, but more price elasticity when it comes to wine. Older consumers would have more price elasticity when it comes to beer, less price elasticity when it comes to wine. And again, the price elasticity just speaks to if we are going to increase the price of a good or service, what does that then mean for demand? That if the price goes up, does demand go down? And there are naturally some goods that are price inelastic. Typically, we're all paying very high gas prices now, but the demand for motor fuels, for gasoline, tends to be a very price inelastic type of commodity in that people need to drive, they need to get to and from work, they've got to put gas in their cars. So they're likely to go out there and purchase gas even if the price of that gas goes up. So it tends to be a very inelastic type of demand. So you need to know the elasticity of the demand among different groups of the public before you're able to actually monetize the benefits and the costs of increasing that type of taxation. Well, ostensibly, if you increase taxation on alcoholic beverages, one of the primary benefits you would get is you would get fewer accidents in which drinking is a factor. So fewer drunk driving accidents. Well, there are different types of drunk driving accidents with different types of costs associated to them. And so if you had a drunk driving accident that resulted in property damage, that's going to be a different value than if you had a drunk driving accident that resulted in an injury versus a drunk driving accident that resulted in a fatality. So you have to then monetize how much are we saving with this law, with the avoidance of the property tax damage, property damage. How much benefit are we getting with avoiding these injuries, and how much value are we getting by avoiding these fatalities? Well, the one that's very difficult to deal with, obviously, will be the fatalities, because what is the value of a human life? And Weimer and Vining in their cost-benefit analysis, just to illustrate some of the difficulties with cost-benefit analysis, said, well, we have to put a value on a human life, because if we're saving 10 human lives by having 10 fewer drunk driving accidents, we have to know how much that is worth. We have to monetize that. So what the authors did is they went out there and did an extensive literature review. And in their extensive literature review, and I think they pulled together like 80 or 90 different academic studies, they came to the conclusion that out of all these studies, the average value of a human life, the monetary value of a human life, is anywhere from $60,000 up to $8 million. They picked $1 million as the value to use in their cost-benefit analysis. But imagine if they would have used 60,000, or imagine if they would have used 8 million. They would have gotten wildly different results with their benefit-cost ratio through that cost-benefit analysis. So I think what Weimer and Vining show us is that even though cost-benefit analysis, this weighing of the monetized cost versus benefits, even though that is a more empirical approach for us to evaluate government intervention in the provision and production of this good or service, the problem is there is still a great deal of subjectivity that is built into even the most quantitative and empirical cost-benefit analysis. But we oftentimes will use cost-benefit analysis to determine, what are the benefits and costs of the government doing it versus what are the benefits and the costs of the private sector doing it. And how you apply that in different policy areas obviously will be different. How you do it in healthcare policy will look different than how you do it in welfare policy, which will look different than how you do it in defense policy, which will look different than how you do it in education policy, because there are different benefits and costs and different ways of monetizing those benefits and costs across all those different policy areas. Another important thing to note as you are evaluating the efficacy of government intervention is, as you're doing this cost-benefit analysis, you also then have to engage in what's called discounting. And if you've had the budgeting course yet, if you have the budgeting course, you're familiar with this idea of discounting. What you need to do is recognize that the value of money changes over time. And so if I would give you $1,000 on January 1st, that $1,000 I give you on January 1st is going to be worth a different amount than the $1,000 I promised to give you the following December 31st. Because if I give you that $1,000 on January 1st, you then have the entire year to invest that money. And so you'll invest that money at a prevailing interest rate so that at the end of the year, that $1,000 you got on January 1st may be worth $1,050, depending upon the prevailing interest rate. So what we have to do is we have to discount future values to present values or compound present values to future values. We have to try and make our values, our monetary values, equivalent across different periods of time. One common way in which this is oftentimes done is with what are called constant dollar years or constant dollar values. So if we want to look at money that was spent by government on this program in 1985 and compare it to how much we're spending in 2022, Obviously, we're probably spending more in 2022 because the value of money is different than what it was in 1985. So what we'll do is we'll put our dollar values into what we call constant dollar years or constant dollar values. So say we'll take the 1985 amount that's being spent and we will then compound that to 1990 values. Then we'll take the 2022 amount and we will discount it back to 1990 values. So we'll say, here are the amounts in 1985 and 2022 in constant dollar year 1990. That then makes it comparable. So you can see relatively, are you really spending more in 2022 than what you spent in 1985? So discounting and compounding are also very important features of doing this type of evaluation with a cost-benefit analysis. But again, the whole purpose of having a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effectiveness analysis is to allow us to have some empirical standards that we can apply to make our decision about whether or not we should have public intervention, and if so, the extent of that public intervention. So for this week, you're going to be taking these concepts and you're going to be applying them in a very brief journal entry. Your journal entry for this week is a brief 2 to 4 page entry in which you will consider the proper roles of individuals versus governments in the provision and production of goods and services. So what types of goods and services do you feel should be left to individuals to provide? What types of goods and services do you think should be provided by government? We have a series of videos that are provided this week. One of those videos I will highlight is the video on the Economic School of Thought. In that Economic School of Thought video, you will be exposed to several different schools of thought on public versus private production and provision. You'll have Adam Smith's theory in there. You will have a lot of different theories presented to you. Keynesian economic theory will be presented in there. Friedman and trickle-down economics will be presented. Those are all different schools of thought in terms of what government should be doing versus what should be left to individual citizens. So after watching that video, consider those schools of thought and which school of thought that you are more in alignment with, and then use those schools of thought to then do this journal entry in which you discuss the proper roles of individual citizens versus government in provision and production of goods and services. Again, this is a very brief journal entry, 2 to 4 pages. But again, it gives you the opportunity, affords you the opportunity to really think through these ideas of government intervention on your own and to kind of form your own opinion in terms of which school of thought you are most closely aligned with. So that's for this week. I hope that you enjoy the journal assignment. I hope that you enjoy some of the videos that you'll be watching for this week and the readings that you will be doing. We're then, from this point, going to move into some specific policy areas, and we'll talk about government involvement in those specific policy areas as we move throughout the remainder of the course. Hope everyone has a good week. If you have any questions all about any of the assignment or any of the readings, feel free to reach out to me and send me an email. Otherwise, have a good week, and I'll talk to you again next week in our week 5 video. So take care.